Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Beitzah Daf Yud Dalid contains 4 Mishnayos discussing several of the halachas of food preparation on Yom Tov. The first Mishnah discusses the halacha of grinding, Machlokes B'Hillel Beishami on the topic. The second Mishnah discusses the halacha of vorer, choosing good from bad or bad from good. And the next 2 Mishnayos discuss sending gifts from one person to another. So the first Mishnah begins by discussing grinding. Grinding is a malacha. The Mishnah works with the assumption that a shinoi, a slight deviation from the normal way of doing things, would make it permitted. And the Gemara discusses 3 levels of shinoi, and that's what tool you're going to use for the grinding. So the normal way things were ground were in a stone kli with a stone grinder. A slight shinoi would be to use a wooden kli and a wooden grinder, and a very significant shinoi would be to use a clay or pottery earthenware kli and grinder. Now, there's 2 types of things to be ground. There's spices, that's plant-based spices, and salt. Salt requires more of a shinoi, the Gemara will discuss why. Spices require less of a shinoi. So, how does it work? So, Beis Shammai says, spices require a mild shinoi, that's with wood. Salt requires a major shinoi, that's with a clay or earthenware grinder. Neither of them can be done with a normal way of doing things in stone. Mesil says no, spices can be done in the regular way in stone, and salt requires a mild shinoi, that of grinding with a wooden grinder. So the Gemara says, you see, everybody agrees though that salt requires a shinoi of some sort. Machlokes is only whether it requires a major shinoi or a small shinoi, but it does require some shinoi. But why is salt different than spices? That salt requires a shinoi and spices is a machlokes whether it requires any shinoi at all. So Gemara says because salt has 2 properties. Number 1, it doesn't spoil. And number 2, you know that whatever you're going to cook, you're going to need salt. Salt goes in every dish. Spices, you don't necessarily know before Yom Tov which spices you needed. Therefore, salt, we can fault you for having not ground it before Yom Tov. And therefore, it's not really okay to grind it on Yom Tov, and you need a shinoi. If you need a big shinoi or a small shinoi. However, spices has those 2 svaras. You may not have known which spice you're going to use before Yom Tov, and the flavor may have gone off. Now, what's an nafkamina between the 2 reasons? The verse says an nafkamina is if you have a spice that has one property and not the other, such as if you know what dish you're planning to make. If you knew what dish you're planning to make and you didn't grind spices for it anyway. So according to the opinion that the stringency of salt is that you knew you were going to need salt, you would have to have a major shina here as well. According to the other opinion, you still didn't want to grind spices before Yom Tov because the flavor would go off. On the other hand, if you're making a dish called moriko, which uses turmeric, and you wanted to make an Yom Tov, you didn't know you were going to make it before, so the svara of you didn't know applies, but the svara of the flavor going off does not apply, and therefore because turmeric's flavor does not go off, and you would need a shinoi for that. Okay, now the Gemara brings a dissenting opinion to this version of the Mishnah altogether. The Gemara says, if Yehuda says name of Shmuel, that all things may be ground in the normal way, and even salt. The Gemara says, what do you mean? In our Mishnah we said everybody says that salt needs a shinoi. So the Gemara says because there's a different Beitzah that presents the machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai differently, and that's Rabbi Meir. And he says as follows: Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai did not argue that you're allowed to grind salt and spices together with a in the normal way. Their whole machlokes is over 2 things. When you're grinding, first of all, are you allowed to grind them separately? Can you grind salt separately? And second of all, what type of purpose are you allowed to grind salt for? Beis Shammai says you're only allowed to grind it with a shinoi for roasting, for salting meat to be roasted, which is not so much salt. And Beis Hillel says you're allowed to grind it with any device and for any purpose. Now, it can't really be with any device, our Gemara says, because we see here that he requires a shinoi, but it could be for any reason whatsoever. According to Beis Hillel, that it could be done in any device, according to this version, there's no issue, and that's how we're going to paskin, and that's how Yehuda and Shmuel paskin halacha l'maaseh that you're allowed to grind them. You're allowed to grind it without any shinoi whatsoever in any way. Okay. Now, the Gemara notes that there's another way of doing a shinoi, and that's if you turn the grinder over sideways. Rav Acha Bardol, Rav said to Rav Acha Bardol, depending on the girsa, when you grind, turn the grinder sideways and you let it do it that way. Now the Gemara says Rav Sheshes was once walking and he heard the sound of grinding and he said, that can't be from my house. In my house they know you're not allowed to grind, and told him not allowed to grind. The Gemara says, how did he know what the sound was? Maybe he was grinding something on the side with this shinoi. They turned the grinder sideways. The Gemara says, no, he could tell by the sound that it made a clear striking sound and not a muffled striking sound, that it wasn't being ground sideways, it was being ground straight up and down. So Gemara says, well, maybe he was grinding spices, which you're allowed to. How does he know you're grinding salt? Gemara says, no, if you're grinding spices, you would hear the sound of the cracking of the spice grains. And now the Gemara brings a Beitzah, which the Gemara analyzes. The Beitzah says you're not allowed to make tisni, and you're not allowed to grind in a grinder. Now, tisni is made with a tremendous tircha. There's a lot of grinding involved. There's a lot of tircha. It has to be split. Each grain has to be split 4 times. It's made from wheat that's split 4 times. A lot of tircha involved. Therefore, you're not allowed to do it. So the Gemara says that this Beitzah is contradictory. On the one hand, you're saying tisni you're not allowed to do because it's a big tircha. On the other hand, you're saying you're not allowed to grind at all. That implies any type of grinding, not just the tisni. Someone says, no, what we mean to say is that the reason you're not allowed to make tisni is because it involves grinding and too much tircha grinding. We don't want you to do that kind of grinding. So the Gemara says, so why don't you just tell me you're not allowed to grind so much, and then I'll know you can't make tisni. The Gemara says, if you would say that, you would not know to differentiate between what size grinder you use. As a matter of fact, the opposite. You would differentiate between what size grinder. You would think it's only us to use a big grinder, which grinds very finely and very nicely, but a small grinder, which is a shinoi, you would be allowed to use. But the truth is, you're not allowed to use either of them. So Gemara says that's not correct. If everybody says you're allowed to use a small grinder, you're only not allowed to use a large grinder. So Gemara therefore changes the answer, and the Gemara says no. So that's what we mean when we say you're not allowed to grind in a large. We say you're not allowed to make tisnis one halacha, you're not allowed to grind. The other halacha is you're not allowed to grind in a large grinder. That's what the Mishnah means to say. Rava gives a different answer. Rava says it depends who's using it. If you're in a place where people have servants, that would be mizalzel. They would cheapen these halachos, so then you're not allowed to use even a small grinder. If in a place where people's servants, either they don't have servants or their servants follow the rules, then you can use a small grinder. The Gemara says that Rav Papi went to the house of Mar Shmuel. They brought him ground up mash, some type of gruel, and didn't want to eat it. So the Gemara says, well, how does he know that it was asr? Maybe it was made in a small grinder. The Gemara said, no, because he had servants that were not well-trained servants, or possibly, a different answer, he could tell it was ground finely and it was made in a large grinder. So the Gemara says, well, maybe it was made before Yom Tov. I still was ground on Yom Tov. There's no, he could tell by the look of it, it would look freshly ground, and therefore he knew it was made on Yom Tov. Gemara now begins and introduces the next Mishnah, which discusses the malacha of borer, separating good from the bad. So if you have, let's say, a mixture of kernels and shells, and you want to separate the bad and the good separately from each other, how are you allowed to do that on Yom Tov? So the Gemara quotes Machokas, B'Sal Beishamai. Beishamai says you're only allowed to take the good, the food part out of the bad. You pick that out, and that's what you're allowed to take. Beisilo says, no, you can take the bad out of the good, or the good out of the bad, and he also says you could use a plate, you could use a small plate, you could use a board of some sort. You're just not allowed to use a sieve or a sifter or a cleave which is specifically designed to separate things. Now Rabban Gamliel adds you can put it all into water and the bad stuff will float to the top and then you just have the food on the bottom. Okay, now the Gemara quotes a Beitzah of Rabban Gamliel, and he says that this entire halacha of Beis Hill that says you could take the good out of the bad, that says you could even take the bad from the good, is only saying that because he wants you to save from tircha. So it's a situation where it's more work to take the good from the bad. So if you have majority bad, then you should take the good out of the bad because that's easier. If you have majority good, then you could take the bad out of the good and be left with just the good stuff, and that's easier. So Gemara says, how if it's majority bad, how do you let it take anything? It's batal barov, and everything is considered to be bad, and it's all muktzah. So Gemara says it's not talking about where it's majority minority. It has to be majority good, otherwise you're right, it would be batal barov. It's talking about where it was a lot of work. It's very fine pieces, and it's hard to pull the bad out. So Basil says, better off taking the easier one and avoiding extra tircha on Yom Tov than trying to take the good out of the bad specifically. Now the Gemara turns its attention to the concept of having it float. The Merkotz Beitzah, it says, Rabbi Tzadok said, in the house of Rabban Gamliel, they used to fill a pail with water. They would put in lentils, and they would fill it up with water, and all the food fell to the bottom, and all the dirt rose to the top. So Gemara says we saw in the Beitzah other ways that the dirt was on the bottom and the food was on the top. And it says depends which type of dirt you're referring to. The broken shells and kernels and things like that, that's all straw, so that floats. The dirt sinks down to the bottom even lower than the food itself, and then you could get the food out. Coming in the next Mishnah, which discusses sending food items from one person to another, and the issue is halachically you're only allowed to send something that could be used for that day, otherwise, again, not something you're supposed to do in Yom Tov. So Bishami says you're only allowed to send ready prepared food, cooked and ready to eat. Misil says you're allowed to send any food that could be prepared in Yom Tov itself. So you can send an animal, a bird, a chaya, live or dead, as long as it could be slaughtered, or it's already slaughtered and you could eat it, and it could be prepared on Yom Tov. You're allowed to send it. You're allowed to send wine, oil, flour, beans. The only thing you can't send is grain, because grain you can't grind on Yom Tov because it's supposed to be ground before Yom Tov. Rav Shimon says you are allowed to send grain because he could cook the grain and make another food out of it besides for something that requires grinding. So the Gemara says, the Gemara now begins, and the Gemara says you just can't send it with a large group of people. How much is a large group? 3 people. Why can't you send it with a large group? It looks like they're going to the market. And Gemara sign. The Gemara says, what if you have 3 different types of things being sent with 3 people? Do you say it's one thing per person and therefore it's mutter, it's not a large group? Or do you say, no, bottom line is that it's a large group and it looks like it's going to the market and therefore it's usher? Okay. The Gemara leaves that question unresolved. Now the Gemara says, Rav Shimon says you're allowed to send grain. So the Gemara says, because there's various different things you could make out of it. Wheat, you can make a dish called ludios. Barley you could feed to your animal, and lentils you can make something called rasisin that Rashi just says is made out of lentils. We now begin the next and final Mishnah of the Daf, which discusses what happens about sending shoes and clothing. And again, the rule, as is spelled out in the end of the Mishnah, is you can only send something which is useful on Yom Tov. You aren't allowed to send something which has no use on Yom Tov. So as far as clothing, the Mishnah says you can send it whether it is already tailored, sewn clothing, or if it's just raw cloth. That's fine. The Gemara explains clothing, of course, you can wear. Cloth is useful to warm yourself, to drape it over yourself, to use it as a blanket or as a wrap. But then the Mishnah says you can even go ahead and send cloth that has shatnez in it, kalayim, which you're not allowed to wear. And the Gemara will explain what use you could possibly have out of that. As far as shoes, so you can only send actually made shoes. You can't send raw leather. Can't make anything out of that. And you also can't send shoes where the leather is nailed to the wooden platform. It's a type of shoe which the Mishnah calls a sandal hamasumber, the nailed shoe. The Gemara will explain that there was an incident that happened, and the Rabbanan made a decree that people shouldn't wear shoes like that, and therefore you couldn't use it. That's the Gemara on the next stuff. Now, Yehuda says you also shouldn't send white shoes which need to be blackened. They need polishing and staining. That requires a worker to perform that task, an expert, a professional, and you're not going to be able to do that, and therefore you're not going to be able to do it on Yom Tov, and therefore it's useless. Now, the Mishnah concludes with, again, the rule, and the Gemara now wants to know, what are you going to do with shatnez cloth? So the Gemara says there's got to be some use for it. So the Gemara says, well, maybe the use is that you can fold it up and sit on it, and that way you're not wearing it. The only issue of shatnez is if you're wearing it and it's somehow providing protection or warmth to your body. So the Gemara says, that's true d'oraisa, but the Rabbanan you're not even allowed to sit on it because we're afraid that a thread will wrap itself around your finger or around your body. Now Rashi explains how is that considered wearing it, just because the thread wraps itself around you. And Rashi has 2 options. One is that it's a very thick thread and therefore it actually wraps you and provides warmth. The other is that the softness of the cloth actually warms you from underneath, but it's not considered wearing unless it's somehow wrapping you. So if you had one thread that wraps around you, now you have fulfilled both conditions. It's warming you and it's wrapping you, and therefore you would be violating the Isser of Shatnez. But either way, the Gemara's point is that there is an Isser D'Rabbanan just to sit on cloth. That is Shatnez. So therefore, what could you possibly do with a Shatnez cloth? That's back to our question. The Gemara says maybe I'll have a couple of layers of non-Shatnez cloth between me and the Shatnez cloth. That way, I won't wrap a thread around myself, but it's still serving me, it's still useful, I'm still sitting on it. So Gemara says, no, that can't be, that's also Asar. Even 10 layers is Asar, it's all included in the decree, the Gezerah D'Rabbanan, that you're not allowed to sit on Shatnez cloth, or use it anyway. So Gemara has a couple of things that you are allowed to do with it. So the Gemara says, first of all, you can be talking about a curtain, where it's useful to hang as a curtain. The Gemara asks, but a curtain is Makabel Tumah because it's a useful object, because the shamish, the worker, will warm himself by wrapping himself in that cloth. Where it says that we're talking about hard cloth, which doesn't give you any warmth, and therefore it has no function. The Gemara has a Hunabed of Yeshua says that a hard rag from a place of Narash is permitted because you can't do anything with it. Rav Papa says a cloth that's used in the heel of a shoe is hard, it doesn't provide any warmth. Rava says a cloth that's used to wrap up your coins doesn't provide warmth, so you could use this shatnez cloth for that. Rav Ashi says that a hard cloth that you use for seeds, so that's actually a machlokes. Rava says that is going to provide warmth. It's a cloth you use to wrap your seeds in. Rav Ashi says it doesn't provide warmth, and therefore that's also permitted, and that's okay. So we have a couple of things on the list that are hard cloths that therefore are permitted to use shatnez cloth for those things.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.